Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might surprise you. The Roman Empire, that vast civilization we think we know so well, was filled with jobs so strange, so specific, and so oddly fascinating that most of them never made it into your history textbooks. From professional armpit sniffers to full-time funeral criers, the Romans had a career path for just about everything. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture Rome at its height, a city of marble temples, bustling forums, and over 1 million people crammed into neighbourhoods that smelled like a mixture of perfume, sewage, and baking bread. To keep this massive urban machine running, Romans needed workers. Not just soldiers and senators, but specialists. People whose entire careers focused on tasks so narrow that modern job descriptions would look positively vague by comparison. These weren't glamorous positions. Nobody wrote epic poems about the man who collected urine for laundries, or the woman who plucked armpit hair for wealthy clients. But without them, Roman society would have ground to a halt faster than a chariot with a broken wheel. Let's start with one of the strangest professions in ancient Rome, the nomenclator. Now, this wasn't just some assistant or secretary. A nomenclator was a slave or freedman whose entire job consisted of memorizing names and faces. Imagine being a wealthy Roman politician walking through the forum. Hundreds of people surrounded you daily, citizens hoping for favours, fellow senators plotting against you, merchants trying to sell you overpriced imported wine. You couldn't possibly remember everyone. That's where your nomenclator came in. This human database walked slightly behind you, whispering names, relationships, and relevant gossip directly into your ear. That's Marcus Tullius, owns 3 olive groves in Campania, his daughter is unmarried, he voted against your grain law last month. The nomenclator made you look brilliant, connected, and impossibly well-informed. You'd greet Marcus by name, ask about his olive harvest, and congratulate him on his daughter's upcoming marriage prospects. Marcus would be flattered. You'd seem like a political genius, and your nomenclator would fade back into the background, already scanning the crowd for the next face. But memorizing names was just the beginning. A skilled nomenclator also tracked debts, recorded who owed whom favours, and noted which families were feuding. In a society where reputation meant everything and insults could spark riots, having someone who remembered that Senator Gaius once called your wine sour at a dinner party 3 years ago was invaluable. The job required an extraordinary memory, absolute discretion, and the ability to remain invisible while being indispensable. Nomenclators were so valued that wealthy Romans sometimes freed them and paid them handsomely to continue their work. Because in Rome, knowing everyone's name wasn't just polite, it was power. Now let's talk about a job that combined fashion, pain, and questionable hygiene: the Roman depilator. In ancient Rome, body hair was considered unrefined, barbaric, the sort of thing you'd expect from unwashed Germanic tribesmen, not civilized Romans. Smooth skin was the standard for both men and women, which created a thriving industry for people willing to rip hair out of other people's bodies for a living. Depilators worked in bathhouses, private homes, and even street corners, armed with tweezers, razors, and a mixture that can only be described as medieval wax. Except it wasn't wax. It was often a sticky paste made from resin, pitch, and sometimes powdered glass. Yes, glass. Because Romans believed that adding abrasive materials helped grip the hair better. Did it work? Probably. Did it hurt? Absolutely. Did people scream? Constantly. The process went something like this. A client, usually naked or nearly so, would lie down while the depilator slathered the paste across their legs, arms, chest, or underarms. Then, with practiced efficiency and zero sympathy, the depilator yanked. The sound was reportedly unforgettable, a mixture of ripping fabric and muffled sobbing. Martial, the Roman poet, even wrote about how you could hear men screaming from depilation sessions blocks away, which suggests that Roman pain tolerance had its limits. For wealthier clients, depilators offered premium services: tweezers made from bronze or iron, scented oils to soothe the skin afterward, and private rooms so you didn't have to scream in front of strangers. Poorer Romans made do with cheaper methods, which often meant more pain, more blood, and significantly more regret. And it wasn't just body hair. Facial hair removal was common too. Romans preferred clean-shaven faces, which meant barbers and depilators worked overtime keeping chins, cheeks and necks smooth. Some men visited daily. Others employed personal depilators who lived in their households, ready to tweeze at a moment's notice. The job required steady hands, a strong stomach, and the ability to ignore profanity shouted in multiple languages. Because when you're ripping hair out of a senator's armpit, you're going to hear some opinions. But for all the pain involved, depilators were respected professionals. They had guilds, regular clients, and in some cases made quite comfortable livings. Smooth skin wasn't optional in Rome, it was a statement, and depilators made sure that statement was loud, clear, and extraordinarily painful. Next, we need to discuss a profession that sounds fake but was absolutely real: the olfactor. Roughly translated, this means smell tester. But that polite term hides a far stranger reality. Olfactors were employed by wealthy Romans to smell everything: food, wine, oils, perfumes, and yes, people. Specifically, they smelled armpits. Before you laugh too hard, understand that in a world without deodorant, antibacterial soap, or daily bathing for most people, body odour was a serious concern. Wealthy Romans, obsessed with personal hygiene and public image, wanted to know if they smelled offensive before attending banquets, senate meetings, or public events. So they hired someone with a trained nose to give them an honest assessment. The olfactor would lean in, take a professional sniff, and deliver a verdict. "You're fine, Dominus," or more awkwardly, perhaps another application of rose oil, Dominus. But smelling armpits was only part of the job. Olfactors also tested food and wine for poison, a genuine concern in a society where political assassination was practically a hobby. They sniffed imported spices to verify authenticity, evaluated perfumes before purchase, and even assessed whether a house smelled appropriately fresh for guests. In essence, they were human quality control inspectors whose primary tool was their nose. The job required a refined sense of smell, discretion, and probably a strong stomach. You couldn't gag when your employer's tunic reeked of 3-day-old sweat and garum, the pungent fish sauce Romans poured on everything. You had to remain professional, tactful, and somehow communicate that yes, a bath would be wise, without insulting the person who paid your wages. Some olfactors became so skilled they could identify wines by region, oils by quality, and even poisons by scent alone. They were trusted advisors walking alongside their employers, constantly sniffing the world for danger, deception, or simply bad hygiene. And in a culture where appearance and reputation meant everything, having someone confirm you didn't smell like a stable before entering the forum was worth every sestertius. Let's move from noses to ears, specifically to one of Rome's most emotionally manipulative professions, the praefica. These were professional mourners, women hired to cry, wail, and generally make funerals as dramatically sorrowful as possible. In Rome, the size and intensity of your funeral reflected your status. A quiet, dignified affair suggested you weren't important. But a funeral with dozens of weeping women tearing their clothes and howling your name to the heavens, that meant you mattered. Praeficae were theatrical experts. They didn't just cry, they performed. They ripped their hair, which was often fake hair attached for exactly this purpose. They scratched their faces, leaving visible marks that demonstrated the depths of their grief. They chanted poems praising the deceased, recounting exaggerated accomplishments, and occasionally inventing entirely fictional heroic deeds. "He once saved a village from a wolf," a praefica might wail, while the deceased's actual family members exchanged confused glances because Marcus had been an accountant who feared dogs. But nobody corrected them. The performance was the point. Families paid well for skilled praeficae. A truly talented mourner could elevate a modest funeral into a citywide spectacle. Crowds would gather, drawn by the noise. Passers-by would ask, "Who died?" And someone would respond, "I don't know, but clearly someone very important." Mission accomplished. The praeficae also served a practical purpose. In a society where showing too much emotion publicly was considered undignified, especially for men, hiring professionals to do your crying maintained decorum. You could stand stoically while hired women sobbed dramatically on your behalf. You looked strong and composed. The mourners looked devastated. Everyone went home satisfied. The job wasn't easy. You had to cry on command, maintain intensity for hours, and somehow make your 15th funeral of the month feel as emotionally raw as your first. Some praeficae became famous, their services requested specifically because they brought a certain style to grief. A dramatic praefica could make a mediocre man's funeral memorable. A lazy one could reduce a senator's send-off to awkward silence. It was theatre, commerce, and social obligation, rolled into one loud, tearful package. Now let's talk about a job that required no tears but plenty of muscle, the Roman urinarii. Before you assume this involved bathrooms, let me clarify. Urinarii collected urine, not as a prank but as a legitimate business. Because in ancient Rome, urine was valuable, genuinely, economically valuable. Why? Because it contains ammonia, which Romans discovered was excellent for cleaning wool, whitening togas, and even tanning leather. Fullers, the people who cleaned and processed cloth, needed massive amounts of urine to do their work, and the city's million residents produced, well, plenty. Urinarii placed large clay jars on street corners, in alleyways, and near public latrines. These jars, called amphorae, sat open to the air, inviting passers-by to contribute, and people did. Men especially, because public urination was socially acceptable, even encouraged when a convenient jar was nearby. Once the jars filled, urinarii collected them, loading the heavy, sloshing containers onto carts and hauling them to fulleries. The smell was, predictably, unforgettable. Imagine rolling through Rome's crowded streets with a cartload of fermented urine on a hot summer day. Traffic didn't part out of respect, it parted out of survival instinct. The Emperor Vespasian, famously practical, even taxed the urine trade. When his son Titus complained about the indignity of taxing pee, Vespasian held up a gold coin and asked, "Does this smell?" The message was clear. Money is money, no matter where it comes from. That phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell, became a lasting reminder that Romans were nothing if not pragmatic. Urinarii weren't wealthy, but they had steady work. As long as people wore clothes and needed them cleaned, urine collectors had jobs. They worked early mornings, avoiding the heat and the crowds. They knew every public latrine, every busy corner, every spot where foot traffic guaranteed full jars. It wasn't glamorous. But in a city where every resource was used, reused and wrung dry, even waste had value. The urinaria made sure none of it went to waste. From urine collection, we moved to something equally unglamorous but far more dangerous, the Roman bestiarii. These were the men who fought animals in the arena. Not gladiators, though the two are often confused. Gladiators fought each other. Bestiarii fought lions, bears, leopards, bulls, and occasionally creatures imported from the far edges of the empire just to see what would happen. The job was brutal, bloody, and had a mortality rate that would horrify modern insurance companies. Most bestiarii were criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war, forced into the arena as punishment. But some were volunteers, freedmen or poor citizens desperate enough to risk death for money, and a slim chance at fame. Training was minimal. You were given a spear, maybe a short sword, occasionally a net, and told to survive. There were no practice rounds with safely defanged lions. Your first fight was real, and if you hesitated, you died quickly. If you panicked, you died messily. If you got lucky, you lived long enough to fight again. Crowds loved it. Watching a man face down a charging leopard, spear raised, sweat pouring, was entertainment Romans craved. The moment of impact, the roar of the beast, the spray of blood, it was visceral, unpredictable, and utterly brutal. Some bestiarii became surprisingly skilled. They learned to read animal behaviour, to anticipate attacks, to strike at vulnerable points with deadly accuracy. A few even became celebrities, their names shouted in the streets, their victories immortalised in graffiti. But most didn't survive long. Even skilled fighters couldn't escape bad luck forever. A lion was faster, a bear was stronger, and the arena floor, slick with blood and sand, was unforgiving. Between fights, bestiarii lived in cells beneath the Colosseum, among the smell of animals, sweat, and fear. They ate simple meals, patched their wounds with whatever was available, and waited for the next performance. Some prayed, others drank, many simply accepted that their next fight might be their last. Yet despite the danger, there was a strange pride among survivors. To face death and walk away, even temporarily, meant something. You weren't just a criminal or a slave anymore, you were a beast fighter, and in Rome, that was a title earned in blood. Let's shift from blood sports to something cleaner, though no less strange. the Roman nomenclature of gladiators, or more accurately, the Lannistae. These were the trainers and managers of gladiators, men who ran the gladiator schools known as ludi, but calling them trainers undersells their role. Lannistae were part coach, part slave dealer, part entrepreneur. They purchased slaves, often prisoners of war or condemned criminals, and trained them to fight. They evaluated body types, assigned fighting styles, and decided who would wield a trident, who'd carry a net, and who'd be thrown into the arena with nothing but a knife and a prayer. A Lannister's reputation depended on the quality of his fighters. Successful gladiators brought prestige, repeat bookings and higher fees. Dead gladiators brought losses, so Lannister walked a fine line. Push fighters too hard, and they'd collapse from exhaustion or injury. Go too easy, and they'd die in their first real fight. The best Lannister understood psychology as much as combat. They motivated, manipulated, and occasionally threatened their fighters into peak performance. They knew when to reward, when to punish, and when to lie about a fighter's chances of survival. Some Lannistae were former gladiators themselves, men who had survived the arena and used their knowledge to train the next generation. Others were businessmen who saw gladiators as investments, valuable only as long as they kept winning. The relationship between Lannister and gladiator was complicated, brutal, transactional, but also strangely paternal. A Lannister who truly cared about his fighter's survival was rare but not unheard of. After all, a dead gladiator was a financial loss. A living champion was a walking advertisement. Lannistae also handled negotiations with wealthy Romans who wanted to sponsor games. They set prices, arranged matchups, and sometimes rigged fights to ensure a crowd-pleasing outcome. It was theatre as much as combat, and the Lannister was the director, choreographing death for profit and entertainment. Now let's talk about a job that existed because Romans loved their public baths almost as much as they loved violence. The Roman bath attendants, specifically the capsarii. Public baths were essential to Roman life. They were gyms, spas, social clubs, and gossip centres, all rolled into one steamy marble-clad building. But they had one major problem: theft. Romans undressed before entering the baths, leaving their clothes and belongings in changing rooms. And in a city where poverty was common and opportunities for easy theft abundant, unattended tunics, sandals, and jewellery vanished faster than you could say, "Where's my toga?" Enter the capsarii. These were attendants stationed in the changing rooms whose sole job was watching people's stuff. Think of them as ancient security guards, except instead of cameras and radios, they had sharp eyes and a willingness to chase down thieves through crowded streets while barefoot. Capsarii were usually slaves or freedmen employed by the bathhouse. Patrons would hand over their belongings, receive a token or wax seal as proof, and head off to soak, scrape, and socialise. The capsarius then guarded those items with his life, or at least his job, because if something went missing on your watch you were blamed, beaten, or fired. Possibly all three. The job required vigilance, a good memory, and the ability to recognise faces. Regular patrons expected their capsarius to remember them. Ah, Marcus, usual spot. Tunic, sandals, and that bronze ring. A skilled capsarius built relationships, earned tips, and sometimes received gifts from grateful clients who appreciated not being robbed. But the work was exhausting. Bathhouses operated from morning until evening. The changing rooms were hot, noisy, and filled with naked, wet, argumentative Romans. Fights broke out. Accusations flew. "That's my cloak." "No, that's mine." And the capsarius had to mediate, all while keeping an eye on everyone else's belongings. Despite the challenges, the job offered stability. Bathhouses were everywhere, and they all needed capsarii. It wasn't glamorous. But in a city where most jobs involved back-breaking labour or life-threatening danger, sitting in a warm room and watching clothes, that was practically luxury. Let's move outside the bathhouse to another essential but unpleasant job, the Roman stercorarii. These were the men who cleaned the streets, specifically removing the waste that accumulated daily in a city of over 1 million people. And when I say waste, I mean everything. Horse manure, human waste, rotting food, dead animals, broken pottery, and the occasional unconscious drunk who'd been mistaken for garbage. Rome produced staggering amounts of filth. Horses, mules, and oxen pulled carts through the streets constantly, leaving behind mountains of dung. Residents emptied chamber pots out of windows, aiming for drainage channels but often missing. Markets discarded spoiled produce. Butchers tossed offal into alleyways. Without someone cleaning it up, the city would have drowned in its own refuse within weeks. Stercarari worked at night mostly. Daytime traffic made their job impossible, and the smell was slightly less offensive in cooler evening air. Slightly. They used shovels, brooms and carts, loading waste and hauling it outside the city walls to dumps or agricultural fields, where it was used as fertilizer. The work was backbreaking, filthy and socially stigmatized. Romans looked down on Stercarari, associating them with the filth they cleaned. Children mocked them, adults avoided them, even other labourers considered themselves a step above. But the Stercarari were essential. Without them, disease would have spread faster than it already did. Plague, cholera and dysentery thrived in filth. Keeping the streets even marginally clean saved lives, even if nobody thanked the men doing it. Some Stercarari were slaves, forced into the work. Others were freedmen or poor citizens who took the job because it paid. Not well, but enough to survive. A few even formed small businesses, contracting with wealthy neighbourhoods to keep certain streets clean in exchange for regular payments. Despite the stigma, the work offered a grim kind of job security. As long as Rome existed, it would produce waste. And as long as waste existed, someone had to clean it up. The Stercarari made sure the empire's greatest city didn't drown in its own success. Now let's talk about a job that required both strength and a strong stomach. The Roman carnifex. This was the executioner, the man who carried out Rome's death sentences, and Rome had many. Crucifixion, beheading, burning, being thrown to beasts, strangling. The Romans were nothing if not creative in their methods of execution. The carnifex handled all of it. Crucifixion was the most common and most brutal. The carnifex and his assistants would strip the condemned, flog them until their backs were shredded, then force them to carry their own crossbeam through the streets to the execution site. There, they'd nail the person's wrists and feet to the wood and leave them to die slowly, sometimes over days. Beheadings were faster but required skill. A clean strike meant a quick death. A clumsy blow meant horrific suffering and public humiliation for the executioner. Romans valued efficiency even in death. For lower-class criminals, the carnifex often used cruder methods: strangulation in prison cells, drowning, or simply beating them to death. The goal wasn't mercy, it was practicality. Executions were public events, and crowds expected a show. The carnifex was both performer and butcher, despised yet necessary. Socially, carnifex were pariahs. Their work marked them as unclean. They couldn't live in certain neighbourhoods, couldn't enter temples, and were generally avoided. Yet the job paid well, because few wanted it. Some carnifex were slaves, forced into the role. Others were freedmen who took the work because it offered steady income despite the stigma. Interestingly, carnifex also served as torturers. When authorities needed information from prisoners, the carnifex applied pressure, literally. Thumbscrews, heated irons, the rack, these were tools of his trade. He worked in the dungeons beneath the city, in spaces where screams were muffled and justice was a flexible concept. Despite the horror of the work, some carnifex took pride in their efficiency. A quick, clean execution was a mark of skill. A successful torture session that extracted information without killing the prisoner prematurely was considered professional excellence. It was a job defined by death, but it required a strange kind of expertise. From death, let's move to something that kept Romans alive: the aquarii. These were the men who maintained Rome's aqueducts, the engineering marvels that brought millions of gallons of fresh water into the city daily. Without them, Rome would have been unlivable. The aqueducts stretched for miles, some elevated on massive stone arches, others running underground through tunnels carved into bedrock. They required constant maintenance. Leaks had to be patched, sediment had to be cleared, channels had to be inspected for damage, and someone had to crawl into dark, cramped, often dangerous spaces to do it. But someone was the aquarii. These workers, usually slaves or freedmen, spent their days inside the aqueduct system. They waded through cold, chest-deep water, scraped calcium deposits from channel walls, and repaired cracks in the masonry. It was dark, wet, and claustrophobic. Some tunnels were so narrow you had to crawl. Others were deep enough that a fall meant death. Cave-ins were a constant risk, and the water, while cleaner than the Tiber River, still carried disease. Infections, hypothermia, and drowning claimed aquarii regularly, but the work was essential. A single broken aqueduct could cut off water to entire districts. Fountains would run dry, baths would close, riots could erupt. So the Equerry worked tirelessly, often unnoticed, keeping the water flowing. Above ground, engineers and overseers got the credit. Below ground, Equerry did the actual work, their names forgotten but their labour indispensable. Some Equerry specialised in particular aqueducts, learning every quirk, every weak point, every section prone to blockage. They became experts, able to diagnose problems by sound alone. A change in water flow, a distant drip. These were clues that told them exactly where to go and what to fix. Despite the danger and difficulty, the job offered a strange kind of satisfaction. You were keeping Rome alive. Every fountain, every bath, every household that received clean water owed that to you. It wasn't glory, but it was purpose. Now let's discuss a profession that combined religion, showmanship, and animal husbandry. The Roman victimarii. These were the assistants to priests during public sacrifices, the men who handled the animals and performed the actual killing. Roman religion required constant sacrifices. Bulls, goats, sheep, pigs, chickens, all were offered to the gods during festivals, triumphs, and important state events. But priests didn't do the dirty work. They prayed, poured wine, and scattered grain. The victimarii did everything else. First, they led the animal to the altar. This required skill. A bull doesn't want to walk calmly to its death. Victimarii used ropes, prods, and sometimes brute strength to guide reluctant animals into position. The animal had to appear willing. Struggling was a bad omen. So victimarii learned to calm animals using gentle voices, strategic positioning, and occasionally drugging them with wine-soaked grain. Once in place, the victimarius struck. For smaller animals, a quick knife across the throat. For larger ones, a hammer blow to the head followed by a blade. Speed and precision were critical. A botched sacrifice meant the gods were displeased, and the whole ceremony had to be repeated, with another animal, at someone's expense. After the kill, victimarii drained the blood into ceremonial bowls, butchered the carcass, and separated portions for the gods, the priests, and the public. The gods received the organs, burned on the altar. Priests took choice cuts. The crowd got the rest, often distributed as free meat during festivals. It was religion, theatre, and social welfare combined. The work was bloody, smelly, and physically demanding. Victimarii spent their days covered in blood, surrounded by the sounds and smells of slaughter. But they were respected. They served the gods directly, and their work maintained the Pax Deorum, the peace between Rome and the divine. Without proper sacrifices, the gods might abandon Rome. Plague, famine, military defeat, all could follow. So victimarii weren't just butchers, they were essential to the empire's survival. At least that's what everyone believed. Let's move to a job that involved less blood but more drama. The Roman auctioneers, known as praeco. These were the men who conducted public auctions, shouting bids, hyping merchandise, and generally turning commerce into performance art. Rome loved auctions. Everything was sold this way. Slaves, land, furniture, jewellery, confiscated property, even entire estates. When a senator fell from favour and his property was seized, it all went to auction. And the praeco ran the show. A skilled praeco was part salesman, part entertainer. He had to project his voice across crowded forums, describe items in enticing terms, and keep the energy high. "Look at this beautiful slave. Strong back, good teeth, literate. Who'll start the bidding?" buyers shouted offers. The praeco repeated them, amplifying excitement. 50 sestertii. Do I hear 60? 60 from the man in the blue tunic. 70. 70. It was fast-paced, chaotic, and required a strong voice and quick mind. You had to track multiple bidders, prevent cheating, and close deals smoothly. Hesitation lost momentum, confusion lost sales, and a failed auction meant lost commissions. Praeco also handled public announcements. When the Senate issued a new law, the praeco shouted it in the forum. When gladiatorial games were scheduled, he advertised. When a reward was offered for a runaway slave, he spread the word. They were Rome's walking loudspeakers, their voices carrying news across the city. Some praeco became famous for their voices alone. A good voice could make a mediocre product seem desirable. A bad voice could ruin a valuable sale. So praeco trained. exercising their vocal cords, practicing projection, and learning rhetorical tricks to manipulate crowds. The job paid well, especially for successful auctioneers who handled high-value sales, but it was exhausting. Hours of shouting left throats raw, and dealing with angry buyers or disappointed sellers was a daily headache. Still, for someone with a strong voice and a quick wit, it was a path to respect and profit. Now let's talk about one of Rome's strangest jobs, the professional diners, known as parasiti. These weren't moochers or beggars. Well, technically they were, but it was a legitimate profession. Wealthy Romans loved hosting dinner parties, lavish multi-course affairs where food, wine and conversation flowed for hours. But a successful party needed energy, laughter and lively guests. If your dinner party was dull, your reputation suffered. So some Romans hired parasiti, professional guests whose job was to attend dinners, be entertaining and make the host look good. A parasite has arrived at the party, praised the food extravagantly, laughed at the host's jokes, and engaged in witty banter. They told amusing stories, flattered other guests, and generally kept the energy high. In exchange, they ate and drank for free. It sounds absurd, but it worked. A skilled parasitus could turn a mediocre dinner into a memorable evening. They knew how to read a room, when to speak, when to listen, and how to make everyone feel clever and important. The job required intelligence, social skill, and a thick skin, because you were essentially being paid in food to be amusing, and if you failed, you weren't invited back. Some parasiti worked for multiple hosts, rotating between dinners like social butterflies. Others attached themselves to a single wealthy patron, becoming a permanent fixture at their events. The best earned reputations as delightful guests, and their presence at a dinner party was considered a mark of quality. But it was a precarious existence. If you gained weight, lost your wit, or offended the wrong person, your career was over. And since you weren't paid in money, just meals, you had no financial security. Still, for someone charming, hungry, and unbothered by mild humiliation, it was a way to eat well and socialise with Rome's elite. Without ever having to cook a single meal yourself, let's move from parasites to another food-related profession. The Rome cooks, specifically the cuckoos. Now, you might think, well, every society has cooks. What's strange about that? But Roman cooks, especially those working for wealthy households, were specialists on a level that would make modern chefs jealous. A single household might employ multiple cooks, each responsible for one aspect of meal preparation. One cooked meats, another handled fish, a third specialised in sauces, a fourth made bread and pastries, and each one guarded their recipes like state secrets. The head cook, or archimagirus, oversaw the kitchen with the authority of a general. He planned menus, managed staff, sourced ingredients, and ensured that every dish met exacting standards. Because in Rome, food was power. A successful dinner could cement political alliances, a disastrous meal could end careers. So the archimagirus wasn't just cooking, he was conducting diplomacy with garum and roasted peacock. Roman cuisine was wildly complex. Dishes combined sweet, salty, sour, and spicy in ways that would confuse modern palates. Honey-glazed dormice, flamingo tongues, peacock brains, sauces made from fermented fish guts. This wasn't food, it was a statement, and the cook made that statement possible. Training was intense. Young slaves apprenticed in kitchens for years, learning techniques, memorizing recipes, and developing the instincts required to adjust dishes on the fly. A skilled cook understood how temperature, timing, and seasoning interacted. They knew which imported spices paired with which meats, how to present food artistically, and how to salvage a dish when something went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. Ingredients spoiled, ovens overheated, guests arrived early. A good cook adapted, improvised, and delivered perfection regardless. Some cooks became so valuable that they were freed and paid enormous salaries to continue working. A few even became wealthy themselves, opening their own schools or writing cookbooks. Apicius, the most famous Roman cookbook, was attributed to a legendary cook whose recipes were passed down for generations. But for every celebrated archimagirus, there were dozens of anonymous cuckoos working in hot, smoky kitchens, shouting orders, dodging flames, and creating the meals that made Rome's elite feel powerful. They were artists, scientists, and magicians, turning raw ingredients into edible status symbols. Now let's discuss a job that required precision, patience, and access to some very expensive materials. The Roman scribes, or scribae. In a society where literacy was limited, scribes were essential. They copied documents, recorded transactions, wrote letters, and maintained official records. But Roman scribes did more than just write. They were artists. Writing on papyrus or parchment required skill. Letters had to be formed carefully, evenly spaced, and perfectly legible. Ink made from soot, gum, and water had to be mixed to the right consistency. Too thick, and it clogged the pen. Too thin, and it bled across the page. The pen itself, a sharpened reed, needed constant maintenance. Scribes worked in libraries, government offices, law courts, and private homes. They copied everything from legal documents to poetry, from military orders to love letters. Some specialized. Legal scribes mastered the complex language of Roman law. Literary scribes copied works by Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero, preserving literature for future generations. Imperial scribes worked in the palace, recording the emperor's decrees and correspondence. The work was tedious. Copying a single book could take weeks. A mistake meant starting over. Your hand cramped, your eyes strained, and the pressure was constant because errors could have serious consequences. A miscopied legal document could invalidate a will. A wrongly transcribed military order could cost lives. Despite the difficulty, scribes were respected. They were educated, trusted, and often freed if they were slaves. Some became wealthy, especially those who worked for powerful patrons, or opened their own copying businesses. In a world where information was power, scribes controlled access to knowledge. They were the gatekeepers of literacy, the preservers of history, and the silent architects of Roman bureaucracy. Let's move to a profession that combined artistry and destruction. The Roman demolition workers, specifically those who dismantled buildings. Rome was constantly rebuilding. Emperors tore down old structures to make way for new temples, forums, and monuments. Fires destroyed entire neighborhoods, requiring cleanup and reconstruction. And when a disgraced emperor's buildings needed erasing from history, demolition crews made it happen. These workers used hammers, chisels, ropes, and controlled collapses to bring down structures. It was dangerous work. Buildings didn't always fall predictably. Collapses could kill workers or bystanders, and valuable materials, marble, bronze, timber, had to be salvaged carefully. Nothing was wasted. A demolished temple's columns might be reused in a new bathhouse. Its bronze fixtures melted down for coins, its marble cut into decorative panels. Demolition crews worked fast. Emperors wanted their projects completed quickly. Delays meant lost prestige. So crews laboured long hours, dismantling Rome's past to make room for its future. Some specialised in specific materials. Stonecutters knew how to remove marble without cracking it. Metal workers extracted bronze fittings. Timber salvagers pulled beams from collapsing structures. It was skilled labour, dangerous but well paid. Because in a city that never stopped building, someone always needed to tear something down first. Finally, let's end with a job that encapsulates Rome's strange relationship with fame, shame, and survival. The buskers and street performers known as scenici. These were actors, musicians, acrobats, and dancers who performed in streets, markets, and during public festivals. They weren't respectable. Roman society looked down on actors, associating them with immorality and low character. But Romans also couldn't resist watching them. Performers juggled, danced, told jokes, acted out comedic scenes, and sang. They wore masks, costumes, and exaggerated their movements to capture attention in noisy, crowded spaces. Some were talented, others were desperate. All were trying to earn enough coins to eat. Children tossed copper. Merchants paused to watch. Even senators, though they'd never admit it, sometimes stopped to enjoy a performance before moving on. The work was unpredictable. A good crowd meant a good haul. A bad crowd meant hunger. Weather, competition, and the whims of the audience determined your income. But for those with talent, charisma, or just stubborn persistence, it was freedom. No master, no schedule, just your skill and the street. And so, across Rome, from the Forum to the Subura, performers entertained, amused, and survived. One coin, one laugh, one performance at a time. The Roman Empire was vast, powerful, powerful and complex. But it wasn't just built by soldiers and senators. It was built by nomenclators who remembered every name, depilators who endured screams, olfactors who sniffed armpits, and countless others whose strange, specific jobs kept the empire running. These weren't the people history remembered, but they were the people history couldn't have happened without, and tonight, finally, they've had their moment. Strange jobs, stranger times, and the eternal truth that every society, no matter how grand, runs on the labour of those we never think about. Until now.